Thank you. Good morning. Before we begin our regulatory panel today, we're going to spend a few minutes looking out at the horizon on the future of financial innovation and RegTech. And we need to get my slides up. Oh, slides are not on the monitor here. Thank you. An event has occurred that has been little noticed, but that has the potential to change regulation as we know it. It could be the equivalent of a regulatory moonshot, an experiment. It happened last winter on December 1st in London, in the Canary Wharf section of London. And a group of people gathered at the Financial Conduct Authority, the primary regulator, non-prudential financial regulator in the UK. And they began working on an experiment to test the question of whether it would be possible to issue some regulation, not in the form of words, but actually as computer code. They had been there for 2 weeks on December 1st. They were tired. They were worried. One of them told me he was terrified. One of them told me it was the most exciting thing he'd ever been involved with in his life. They had been having some failure, and they gathered around a computer screen to see whether they could run an experiment to test the idea of issuing regulation as code. Before I tell you how the experiment went, I want to take you back 5 months earlier to a conference that I convened last June at Harvard University. I was a senior fellow there at the time. And we pulled together a group of people to build on the momentum, much of which was led by the FCA in FinTech and RegTech under the leadership of Chris Woolard, the FCA's head of strategy. They had long ago already launched their regulatory sandbox on the question of how to regulate FinTech as regulators. That was already being emulated around the world. 24 countries had adopted sandbox efforts in their regulatory groups. But less known was the fact that about 1.5 years after launching all that, they developed a RegTech initiative to look at the possibilities of bringing technology into how they regulate. RegTech was catching on, much more so outside the United States than inside, but conferences were developing, NGOs and global organizations were picking up RegTech as a priority and trying to promote financial inclusion worldwide. Regulators around the world were starting to innovate with it. And RegTech groups were forming. I'm affiliated with 3 of these. Suddenly, there was tremendous activity in RegTech. And I knew that we had reached a tipping point when this showed up in my Twitter feed. This is a picture that was taken in the Singapore subway. And the ad on the right is a RegTech ad in the subway. You know the world is changing when something like that would happen. So we convened at Harvard, and we brought together a group of people to talk about this question. Could technology redesign regulation itself? We brought in a group of deep regulatory experts who don't know much about technology, and incredible technology experts who don't know much about regulation. And the regulatory people knew they had a problem with making regulation efficient and effective and think that you can't really solve it. And the tech people actually have the solution to it, but they don't know about the problem, or they think it's a boring problem. So we put them together in the same room for a day, and we worked on these big questions of what might we be able to do. We asked the question, is there a model in what was done in creating the World Wide Web? When Sir Tim Berners-Lee created a working group, and they came up with the idea that we could be interoperable with HTTP. We asked the question, might compliance and regulation be able to migrate onto a platform like an app store where people could have open source and share and innovate in a flexible way instead of in the rigid systems that we have now? And we asked this question, could we start to rethink how to do regulation? This is a picture of former Congressman Barney Frank of Dodd-Frank fame. He's a brilliant lawyer. But what if we started to think of some regulation as it might be designed by Steve Jobs? How would there be a difference between those 2 approaches? And we thought that maybe regulation could be issued in the form of code someday, maybe 5 or 10 years from now. One of the people who came to the conference was the man on the right, Nick Cook, who heads the UK RegTech group. And 5 months later, to my astonishment, they decided to test whether this could be done by running an experiment on machine-executable regulation. And to do it, they used a new system that they have created there, an innovation as regulators, called a tech sprint. A tech sprint is actually a hackathon. They're regulators, so they don't like the word hack, so they call it a sprint. And they bring people into the same room, again, who are financial and regulatory experts and who are technology experts, and give them a problem to solve live. In this one, they had 100 people involved, 20 organizations, banks, tech firms, academics, all the way across, struggling with this issue. They divided them into 2 groups. They have what they called a text group of regulatory experts and a tech group, and some people who were bilingual between the 2 languages and could go back and forth and cross-translate. And they worked on training an algorithm to look at a set of dummy data and figure out whether a given loan was reportable under the retail reporting requirements of the FCA, and if so, what needed to be reported and how could you report it. They worked on this for 2 weeks. They were exhausted, they had failures, and they ended up, as I said, all gathered around late on a Friday afternoon on a cold, darkening day in London, and they pressed a button on the computer, and the experiment worked. It took 10 seconds for the computer to read a revised regulatory reporting requirement, put it against the data, and correctly produce a regulatory report with the required information. A process that might have taken 2 years, the old-fashioned way. When this happened, the room erupted in cheers. 6 months later, next week, May 22nd, they're going to do another tech sprint building on this one at the FCA. I'm going to be there, as will some others here. And they are this time going to focus on anti-money laundering. The UN tells us that there's $2 trillion a year in laundered money and that we're catching 1% of it with our analog tools. And we know we can do better than that. We're spending $50 billion a year to get a 1% result. They're going to tackle that problem with 500 people in a massive tech sprint that's really going to change how people are doing things. The FCA's RegTech team is 7 people, and they have hundreds of people helping them because people can begin to see the potential for doing all of this in a different way that would cut the costs and improve the results at the same time. And very importantly, at the sprint next week, the United States is going to be there. Most of our regulators are going. A lot of our US banks are going to it. They have 22 agencies from around the world participating in learning this new way of problem solving through technology and collaboration as they go through. So what we're doing is digitizing regulation, financial regulation, making it digitally native. When you do that, things become better, faster, cheaper at the same time, and we begin to really be able to see the potential of really heroic efforts like these changing things. So I want to close by asking you a question. When was the last time you saw a room full of bankers and regulators burst into cheers together? Never. This is a moonshot. This is a tiny, small step that could lead to a giant leap in how we think about and perform financial regulation.